Georg Hegel is best known as a philosopher rather than as an art historian. His version of idealism and his notion of a Zeitgeist, or spirit of the times, are still influential today. But in his career, which spanned the late 1700s and early 1800s, Hegel did write repeatedly on art and aesthetics, and in fact he even advanced a provocative history of world art. And while his specific art historical claims may not have many adherents today, his approach is still well worth considering, both for the nature of his logic and for the many ways in which later art historical writing responded to those ideas. Hegel, who was born in Stuttgart in 1770 and spent much of his adult life as a professor, was a prolific writer, and he could also be formidably abstract. As a result, it can be difficult to summarize his views succinctly. One of his most consequential assumptions, though, was that human history is generally characterized by progress, but by a progress characterized by conflict and tension rather than a smooth, linear quality. Hegel often spoke in terms of a dialectical tension between opposing possibilities or positions that he termed a thesis and an antithesis. Over time, he argued, the tension between the two eventually resulted in a synthesis or a productive resolution. And behind this process was what Hegel called the Geist, or spirit, an animating force whose gradual manifestation essentially powered human history. Hegel developed these ideas during a turbulent period in European history, and it seems clear that they were informed to a certain extent by the rise of Napoleon and subsequent talk of revolutions. But Hegel was not merely a political philosopher. He was also interested, among other things, in art. And in looking at the history of art, he felt that here too he could detect meaningful contours and a pattern of prolonged revelation. Art, Hegel argued, was different from mere nature in that it communicated an essentially spiritual content. A bird's feathers, in other words, might be beautiful, but they were not an expression of an idea. By contrast, art involved, in Hegel's view, a basic tension between material, oil paint, say, or marble, and the idea, by which he meant, again, a sort of universal consciousness. Having taken these steps, Hegel could then point to what he felt were three distinct stages in the history of world art. In what he called the symbolic era, the idea was still indeterminate, or less than fully formed. The great pyramids of Giza, he felt, embodied such a stage, as their heavy, rough, blocky geometry more or less overwhelmed any meaningful spiritual content. The classical era, to Hegel, constituted a more harmonious relationship between the two. In a 5th century Greek sculpture, for example, he held that external matter and idea mutually coexist in a balanced manner. And then there was the Romantic era, or the age of Renaissance and Baroque religious painting, in which, Hegel contended, the idea was now perfected and had fully transcended the physical. The spirit, in short, had triumphed over inert form, and art's evolution was complete. Now, clearly this is a teleological narrative in which Hegel describes a slow motion towards an ideal end. Obviously, it's also a very judgmental account, which plainly favors modern Christian art and positions ancient African architecture as a sort of mute, inert mass of stone. Indeed, we might even note that his tripartite scheme was quite consciously Christian. In fact, as a Christian, Hegel was sensitive to the central importance of the Trinity, or Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and often arranged his claims in a correspondingly pious, three-part manner. But his ideas can be framed in other ways, too. His privileging of the idea, for instance, might remind you of Plato's emphasis on ideal forms, which are only partially manifested in this coarsely physical world. At the same time, too, Hegel's account represented a decisive step away from the biographical art history practiced by, say, Vasari. Individual artists have little place in Hegel's philosophy, which is unapologetically interested in much larger patterns and forces. Hegel's influence was immense, and it's clearly discernible in the work of later thinkers as diverse as Marx, who drew on the notions of thesis and antithesis in formulating his celebrated account of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and Martin Luther King Jr., whose famous claim that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, is basically Hegelian in its view of history. Many art historians have also embraced and grappled with Hegel's analyses. Certainly, some have criticized the notion of the Geist as conveniently abstract or frustratingly vague. But E.H. Gombrich once called Hegel's lectures the founding document of the modern study of art. And when, in 1923, the famous architect Walter Gropius claimed that the attitude of a period to the world becomes crystallized in its buildings, for in these both the spiritual and material resources of the age find their simultaneous expression, well, Gropius was advancing a purely Hegelian set of ideas. And of course, if you've ever heard of a reference to the Zeitgeist, well, you have Hegel to thank. So, while Hegel may have lived 2 centuries ago and may be best known as an idealist philosopher, his influence on the history of art was considerable, and his ideas are still traceable in common speech today.